fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
You are back in the House of Mystery, and I'm Al Warren, still here, still fighting the big one. And down in the city of Boston, David North Martino is there. He's on the street asking people questions.
Man on the street interview.
Yeah, well, hopefully it goes better than the last one.
I know, right?
Yeah. So here we go. So I'm still fighting the old, I guess the COVID or whatever that.
Oh no,
that virus they're talking about. But I don't know how I would get it, but triple shot it and sitting in here all by myself.
Yep. Hidden away
with my dog. Oh no, they're talking
Who's your
about
dog?
We can give it to the dog.
Oh no,
that's the only thing I've got left. That's all I've got left. It's the only one that hangs out and talks to me. So yeah, it's too bad. Anyway, can't win. Well, so we'll talk more later. We've got another fantastic author. What a week, hey? Dean Koontz, Paul Bidich, and now we've got Mr. Jeff Strand. So thank you for being here, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
Yeah. So what have you been up to since we talked to you last year? You all sorts of new things. Do you write all the time, or do you ever stop?
I pretty much am always working on something. It's never like, I've completed all the writing I need to do for a while, because there's always the financial need to, keep the productivity going, because it's my only source of income. So, and I'm not successful enough to do that thing where I do a book every decade. That would be wonderful. All right, I have written my book for the 2020s, and now I'll sit around and live a life of leisure and wait for the next idea to come to me. It's always like the end, chapter 1. So I'm pretty much always on the hamster wheel, but it's better than when I worked the day job for a couple of decades. So.
Oh yeah, it's always better when you can break away from that. Working the drive-through. It's always it's always better. I wonder now. So under that kind of pressure, how do you stay fresh? Like, how do you keep it so that you're not just falling into let's say a formula when you write some books?
Well, a lot of it is I occasionally, if I have earned the right to do it, I'll do sort of an outlier book, which is I'll do kumquat, a romantic comedy, or bang up, a smut comedy, or just sort of something that I know may not sell as well, but just to keep things fresh. I did my first nonfiction book, The Writing Life, last year, and I knew that was not, that was a little bit more of a limited appeal type thing. So that one, kept it fresh. It was fun to do nonfiction. People really liked it. It sold badly as expected. And then I have to go back and do a horror thriller thing that I know will keep the bills paid. And then within that, horror, you can do a ton of stuff and keep things fresh. I can switch from third person to first person. I can do one that's more supernatural horror and one that's thriller. I can, vary up how much comedy is in it. I'm not doing, my 18th installment of a PI series where I'm like, man, how do I keep this going? And I sort of bounce around a lot, even within the horror genre. So I try to not repeat myself from book to book.
Yeah. Do you think it's really hard to change the genre of style that you're writing? As in fans, like will they not really jump over to you just because you write a comedy?
Right. A lot of times they won't. And it's like, look, if you like my stuff, kumquat, it's got a dark sense of humor. It's, just as good as anything else. But for the most part, horror readers are not going to read a romantic comedy no matter who wrote it. So,
yeah.
So it's like,
It would be like you being in a heavy metal band and all of a sudden you do a pop song.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have generally found that if I veer away from horror suspense, the sales, suffer for it. But I still like to do it. It's like, okay, fine. So Kumquat didn't sell very well, but it's out there. The people who did read it really liked it, and now it's time to pay the bills with Wolf Hunt 3 or whatever.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You gotta keep the money coming in.
Yep.
So now on your new book, Deathless, what's the premise of this book?
Deathless is a sequel to one of my most popular books, Pressure. So it is essentially Pressure takes place over about 20 years, and it was originally published in 2007. So I thought, well, now's a good time to do a sequel, which it picks up right where the previous book left off and then covers about the same amount of time. And Pressure is basically the story of a kid whose best friend turns out to be a serial killer and sort of follows them from kids to meeting in college to meeting as adults. Our hero wins at the end of Pressure, but the villain, Darren Rust, doesn't die. He goes to prison for life. And so Deathless opens with our hero, Alex, trying to move past that and obviously not succeeding very well.
Yeah. Well, and that was like 2012 Pressure. So over a 10-year span, how is it you can go back and remember? Or do you have kind of an outline? So some of the characters and what they've done and kind of who they are.
I had to just reread it and refresh my memory and take notes on the little details I've forgotten. But I generally, when I do sequels, I almost never crank them out back to back. It's always, we've been waiting 11 years for the next Andrew Mayhem book. And so, but for the most part, because I get so heavily immersed in my characters when I'm writing, it's not usually that hard to pick it back up. I have to, go through and remember plot details, but I can get into Andrew Mayhem's voice really quickly. And with the 3 Wolf Hunt books, I can get right back into George and Lou really quickly. And this is kind of the same thing with Deathless, which is also first person. Once I reread Pressure, it's like, all right, I am back in Alex Fletcher's voice and back into the story. So aside from, refreshing my memory on what actually happened, as far as the characters, I can jump into that pretty easily.
Would you consider turning Pressure and Deathless into a series, or are you just going to keep it these 2 books?
I have considered a third one. It would probably be kind of the same thing, where, you wait another 15 years and then, hey, here's the third installment in the trilogy. It's first person, so it's not a spoiler to say that our hero doesn't die at the end. It's not like, and I was a ghost the whole time. You can, I can bring him back. He is still alive at the end of Deathless. But it would be, a long time. I'm certainly not going to jump right into it unless, it gets picked up as a TV series and then all right, we need more material to keep it going. Then I would, fast track it quite cheerfully. But at this point, it's it'll be a long time before I revisit it, but I'm certainly not ruling it out because people like Death. So if I would have been, this is a shameful, inferior cash grab to Pressure, then I would say, okay, it's time to be done. But people have liked Deathless as much as Pressure, so at some point there may very well be a third one.
So when you say you can get right back into the voice of the character, how much of you is in that character?
Personality-wise, very little. And that kind of is true for almost all my characters. It's never like, hey, this character is an avatar for me. However, I have, my writing style is pretty distinct, and I've, so I'm not trying to do a completely different writing voice each time I do a first-person book, which is what Deathless is. So, to some degree, they write like me, but personality-wise, it's not me at all on the page.
Well, how do you find yourself getting into that then? Like when you're writing about that character, it's not really you, it's someone else personally. So how do you know what they're going to do?
It's like an actor. It's like, okay, what would this person do in this situation? So generally, I'm pretty mellow and, take a really analytical approach to everything, which does not generally make for good drama, fast-paced horror stories. So I kind of have characters who are ruled more by emotion than I am. So from there, it's like, in this situation, I would stop and, analytically work out a solution, whereas Alex is going to freak out and immediately, try to solve it right away. So it's kind of from that perspective. And, with Wolf Hunt, George and Luther, they're funny guys, but they're ultimately bad guys. They're the heroes of the Wolf Hunt books, but in other, they are the villains in other people's life stories. And so from then, it's like, okay, what would I do if I was, a thug for hire? And Andrew Mayhem is, I've done 5 Andrew Mayhem books. Those are also in first person. And he's generally a guy who will make the wrong decision almost every time. He's not stupid. He just tends to, act without thinking. And, he will, if you're supposed to go left, he will probably go right. And so from that perspective, I can write the books and just, okay, what would I do if I were making the wrong decision in this particular problem? But I do have to reread the books. It's not just like, I have the complete, I remember everything that happened in Pressure. I can jump right back into it. I have to, revisit the book and then take it from there.
Well, do you have an inner monologue when you write? Can you hear Andrew and your other characters as you're writing? We just want to know if you hear voices.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I've heard that was weird. It was pretty recently when I've heard, some people don't have a inner monologue. Like, what?
Yeah.
Like they don't hear anything in their head. Like, wait, that's weird.
I agree.
It's like, how do you, I don't know. Of course, they're probably thinking, wait, you hear voices in your head? How are you not insane? Like, how can you live like that? How do you sleep when there's a voice screaming in your head? So, but yes, I absolutely hear them as I'm writing. They don't tell me what to do. It's not one of those, my characters decide their own fate for me. I'm just the conduit. It's like, no, I tell them what to do, but I absolutely hear what I'm writing.
Wow. That sounds insane.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, I'm all writing true crime nonfiction cults and stuff. So I don't hear voices. I go talk to the people. So it's kind of weird. But hey, if it works, you haven't blown up any buildings or anything lately. So, well,
that you know about.
Yeah, that we know about. So when you finish this book, at the end of it, when someone picks up Deathless and they take it home and read it, is there something you hope that they pick up from the book besides the story?
It's not too much. It's not a book which is like, here's the message I'm trying to convey. It is about trying to move, beyond your past, where it's, he's in this situation where he just can't escape the shadow of, of Darren Rust, who did so much horrible stuff and essentially destroyed his life in Pressure. Deathless is trying to move beyond it and not being able to, both for internal and external factors. But as far as a message, there's not really, the message would be try not to have a best friend as a kid who turns out to be a serial killer.
You don't always have a choice. You don't know necessarily, right?
Right. That's part of the tragedy of Pressure and Deathless.
Yeah. It's kind of a.
It's not a message book. There are deep themes in it, but it's not here's what I want you to walk away having learned from my dark comedy horror thriller books.
You like to mix comedy in with the horror. Is that just because it's part of your personality? Is that kind of what you're putting out there? Or is there a kind of you just like it to be a little bit lighter on the side?
No, it's pretty much just my natural style. I'm not, Deathless has a lot of humor in it, but I'm not thinking, okay, this scene needs to be hilarious. It just sort of comes out in the dialogue and the description. I've heard people say that Deathless, unlike Pressure, which is dark and humorless, Deathless has a funnier tone. Like, I don't agree with that. I think Pressure is also really funny, but I think with Pressure, people weren't expecting the book to be so dark. and it kind of overrode all the humor that's in the book. I think Pressure has, humor through the whole thing. And I think with Deathless, they were expecting something really dark, and so the humor stood out, even though I think both books have about the same amount. But no, it's a very natural thing. It's not something where I'm like, unless I'm writing a comedy for kids, my young adult books, it's like, okay, this scene needs to be funny because these books are just, joke, 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 joke. But for the adult horror stuff, something like Deathless, I use it consciously, to relieve tension, to, make you empathize with the characters, but it's a very natural, instinctual type thing. It's not, well, this book needs to have humor in it. I write books and they end up with humor in them.
Well, you've also, in that same vein, you've emceed the Stoker Awards, where you have to do, kind of like a stand-up,
Yep.
and that takes comedic timing, and you do it very well. Do you feel that humor in fiction also takes a type of comedic timing?
Yeah, and it's tricky because you have, you're trying to control the pace, which is really outside of your control. And sometimes I'll listen to audiobooks, and it's like, wow, that's not at all that's not the timing I had intended for it. So yeah, it's tricky because, you can't control the pace at which they're reading. You can't control how they're hearing it. They may be speed reading, they may be skimming. It's kind of out of your control, so you just do the best you can. But it's a little bit different because with fiction, or, even when I'm reading it out loud, if I'm reading a short story, not every joke has to land. It's kind of fine. You're there for the story and you want them to laugh as much as possible, but it's not like, oh man, that joke didn't work, I'm screwed. Whereas when you're doing the stand-up comedy, especially with the Stokers, like the monologue is kind of fine. If a joke doesn't work in the monologue, you just move on to the next joke. But a lot of the category introductions are a single joke. So I go up, do my joke, and that is it. And if that joke doesn't work, then I'm just walking off stage to awkward silence. And so there's a lot more pressure, for something like emceeing where every joke needs to land, or I need to have a backup line. Yeah, which I do that too, where it's like, okay, if this joke doesn't work, here's my, saver. And so, there are contingency plans, but there's a lot more pressure on a joke to work in the stand-up type thing than there is in fiction.
Yeah. And you get an automatic response when you're in a live setting like that too. It's not like a book where you don't just get that response. You're not with that person while they're reading. So that's a different feeling.
Yeah.
Now, do you like to use a lot of gore or violence in the book, or do you like to read that type of a book? I am a fan of splatterpunk extreme horror, but I'm never like, oh man, that was so gory, it was so good. I'm not someone who pulls back. I use really the amount of gore that's necessary for the story, because I got some reviews that were surprised by how little gore is in my book, Autumn Bleeds into Winter. And it's like, that wasn't a conscious effort. That was a story that did not require gore. And, Allison, that's a pretty gory book because it needed to be. The story required it. I don't get into the really elaborate descriptions, but I don't get into the elaborate descriptions of anything. So I'm not someone who does, 2 pages describing how his character looks. So therefore I'm not going to do 2 pages describing when someone's arm gets pulled off. So I'm not hugely, descriptive in my writing. And the amount of violence kind of depends on the story. So if it's, I tend to choose stories that do require quite a bit of violence and gore, but it varies by book. So The Odds is not really that violent of a book because it didn't need to be, whereas The Haunted Forest Tour is a gore fest from beginning to end because that's, it is a carnage-packed monster extravaganza. So I'm certainly not I hate gore, and I develop suspense by the dew dropping from a leaf on a eerie, fog-filled afternoon. That's not me, but I'm not, into the really graphic blow-by-blow descriptions in my own right. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy a good Edward Lee book or something like that.
Were you influenced by the early splatterpunks, the splatterpunks of the 1980s?
I don't know that I was influenced them as much as I just sort of like to read them. It depends if you consider Richard Lehman a splatterpunk, because I was definitely influenced by him just because I thought I was doing something wrong when I was writing books where I didn't have a whole lot of description. And then I read his stuff, and he also does not do a whole lot of character description. He's kind of just like, here's what happened. So I read early Richard Lehman. Wow, this guy is, I'm not doing it wrong. That's what this guy is doing. So from that standpoint, I was influenced, but not from the standpoint of, the amount of violence and stuff. But I certainly, I enjoyed Skip Inspector and all the people of that era. But I also enjoyed, Dean Koontz and Charles Grant and, the quiet side and the side. I tend to, if you ask me, all right, you get to choose one. Do you want the harder stuff or the more atmospheric stuff? I would pick the harder stuff, but that was never like, oh, I only read splatterpunk or I only read quiet horror. I sort of liked on all ends of the spectrum.
What feeds your own writing, your own imagination? Is it other writers, or is it like horror movies, or is it something different, like watching ballet? Like what feeds that?
A lot of times it's, and not so much from direct inspiration, but, if you watch a really good movie, then I'm kind of inspired to, step up my game. If I read a really good book, then I'm, all right, time to get creating. But, again, because I'm a full-time writer who needs to be prolific to keep that up, a lot of it is just sit down and brainstorm. It is the butt-in chair type thing. I have, it's like, okay, if I want to not come crawling back to a corporate desk job, I need to finish this book. And so to finish this book, I need to sit in front of the computer and type the words that finish the book. So the inspiration just comes from saying, hey, this is my day job. This is how I make a living. So I need to sit down and do it.
So you actually schedule yourself like kind of, let's say 9 to 5 days a week, or, and just sit there and do it?
I'm not that regimented, but it is like I need to write, every day. And so it's not, I will get up and I will start work at 9 and I will punch out at 5. It's just, I need to be working a lot. So, as you watch the bank account dwindle, it's like, all right, it is time for a new book. And if I'm not feeling particularly motivated, that doesn't matter because, the bills are still going to come due. You don't get to write, a note on your phone bill saying, hey, the muse wasn't here this month, so sorry.
Yeah. Well, I just, that, in a way, that would be kind of hard in a sense, I guess, that's because you're not always in the mood. Did you have to be in a mood in order to actually write? Or do you just sit there and then all of a sudden it'll come to you? Or what do you do if you're not feeling it?
Fortunately, that's pretty rare. So if I'm really just like, this isn't working today, I have the luxury of saying, okay, I'm just going to do something else. But to counteract that, I, will sometimes just work on multiple projects that are very different from each other at the same time. So if I'm writing a really dark thriller and I'm also writing a goofy comedy for kids, if it's like, I'm struggling with these jokes today, well, then I'll just go write a really intense, disturbing scene. Or if I'm not in the mood for that, then okay, then I'm writing as many jokes as I can squeeze into a single book. So that's one way to help. Usually if I'm really not feeling it, if I go for a walk and listen to music, then I can snap back into it. But yeah, pretty much, the fact that it is my day job, I don't have a choice but to do this, that's a pretty strong source of inspiration.
Do you feel it affects you personally when you write it? Do you need to find a way to relax and recharge between books and chapters? Is that something that is necessary for you?
No, same thing. If I watch a horror movie, I'm not like, oh man, I'm so disturbed, I can't do anything. So yeah, I don't have that where, I wrote this scene that was so disturbing that I just couldn't function for the rest of the night. Because I'm still focusing on the analytical portion a lot. I don't tend to do the thing where, my fingers were typing the words and I wasn't even really aware of what was happening. I'm like, okay, is this the correct word? Okay. if I break it into a paragraph, am I better emphasizing that particular shock? And, so I'm always focused on the technical aspects of how to deliver the, horror elements the most effectively. And so that kind of takes away from the personal impact on me. So I don't have those things where I go into the fugue states and I'm just typing and it's taking over. I'm always focused on the technical aspects of making it as good as possible. So my own work doesn't really disturb me. My own work also doesn't make me laugh. So I'm not like, my God, I'm a comic genius. I am like, okay, how can I fine tune this joke to make it funnier? Okay, what if I shortened it? What if I did this? And so I'm not at my computer laughing hysterically at the hilarious material I came up with. I'm too focused on the technical aspects to laugh at it.
The title, Deathless, where did that come from?
Just came from the idea that he can't escape his past. So it's sort of like, and the word itself doesn't appear in the book. I wanted to explain it, and I didn't want the dun dun dun. That's why it's called Deathless. But the theme is that, despite the fact that he won in the first book and Alex Rust is behind bars, presumably for the rest of his life, he's sort of deathless. He just cannot get past him.
So in today's times, do you find that you write differently, or you are more careful with your dialogue because of an amount of political correctness, or are you worried about emphasizing the wrong thing? It's not generally something I worry too much about, because it's not something I would have done before. If there's going to be a racist comment, it's clear that the characters are racist. It's not like, hey, it's me, Jeff Strand, doing a hilarious racist joke. It's, if a character is politically incorrect, then the character will say politically incorrect stuff. And, my book, Facial, it has multiple first-person narrators, one of whom is just a, incredible misogynist, but that's not me. That is a really unlikable character. And so because, I'm writing books about, characters, I haven't had any kind of criticism saying, hey, this book is sexist, this book is homophobic or whatever. That isn't really something where I'm like, oh, I need to stop being so homophobic because of the current, I haven't really, had that issue. So as far as, political correctness, they're dark humor. They're often in very bad taste, but I haven't had to reel anything back because I haven't done anything that would get me canceled by, Well, get on that. What are you doing?
Yeah.
You get more followers. How long does it take you to do one of this? Like, how long did Deathless take you to put together?
Deathless took longer than usual, and I'm usually pretty quick. I think Deathless probably took about 8 or 9 months. And I was working on other stuff at the same time because, it would be nice to be able to, perfect a book over 2 years, but I have to generally get them out a little bit faster than that. But Deathless, just because, it was it's the sequel to one of my most popular books, so you don't want to screw it up. So there was a lot of, it was written at a slower pace than my usual stuff. Not that my other stuff is just, cranked out as fast as I can because I don't care, but there was more attention just to making sure that it lived up to the first book. Because if I write an original book, I only have to live up to, I want it to, bring my A game every single time, but it's not, well, this needs to be better than a specific book. And Pressure is a really dark, intense story. So it's like, okay, how do I match the intensity of Pressure in a different story? So, I was sort of competing with myself with that book. But, so it took a little bit longer, but still, I think it was like 8 or 9 months. I don't know if that is super fast or super slow. For me, it was kind of slow.
So if someone's never heard of you before, hard to believe, but they were to pick one book, what book besides the new one would you suggest that they get to really get the feel of your writing?
if I have no contact with this person, I would probably start with Autumn Bleeds into Winter, which I think is one of my more mainstream books. Usually it's like, okay, what do you like? And if I have a vague idea of what they like, my answer will change. I'll say, well, start with Blister, or start with Cyclops Road, or start with Wolf Hunt. But without, answering it just in real general terms, I would go with Autumn Bleeds into Winter, which I think is one of those that, it's a good representation of my style, but it's a little more mainstream than some of my other stuff, less violent, just because the story didn't need it. More of a suspense type thing.
Did you ever look back at some of your older books and decide that you'd like to change them?
Oh, there's no way I could ever look at an old book and not want to change them. The most painful part of the process for me is reviewing galleys, where the book is done, the publisher sends you, like, here's your final proofread, and all you can change are mistakes. You can't say, this line would be funnier this way. You can't change anything unless it's an actual error. And that is miserable for me, because that's when I see all kinds of stuff I want to change. But no, there is no book ever that I will say, nailed it. That is exactly the way the book should be. I really don't revisit my old stuff unless there's a sequel. So like I hadn't reread Pressure in, since it was published, and then it came time for Deathless, and then I had to read Pressure, and it's like, hey, I still like the book, but yeah, I would write a lot of stuff differently. And whether I read it, 10 minutes after it's done or 10 years, I'm never going to be satisfied. I will always wince and say, I should have done that differently. And that's just, I'm absolutely not someone who says that book is perfect. I wouldn't change a word. There are always lots and lots of words I would change.
Well, I'm curious. You're pretty active in the horror community, and I found the horror community back in the days of Shock Lines, the old Shock Lines message board. I was just curious how you found your way into the horror community itself.
Well, I love Shock Lines. Shock Lines is sort of how I got back into it, because I wasn't that big a part of it for a while. But I started just because I was a horror fan, and this was pre-internet, so I was, this was back when you could go to, like, a grocery store and they would have a horror section up there. Yeah. So I was, it would be, let's go to the grocery store. Hey, there's a new horror book I've never heard of. That looks good, so I'll read that. That was the time, before my, to be read pile was more than I could read, for the rest of my life. I now have more books, unread books, than I could read if I did nothing but read for the next 50 years. But back then, it was like, I just read the book. Now I'm going to go pick up another book to read. And so I was sort of doing them one at a time. And then I got Writer's Digest back, or Writer's Market, which was the book version of Writer's Digest. And it's like, hey, there's the Horror Writers Association. I'll check that out. And so I, you get the newsletter, and that would be sort of my connection point to the rest of the horror industry. And then the internet happened. In a real basic version, there was Genie, which was just all text, but they had it was a bulletin board system, so you'd do a post and then someone could do a comment after it, or so just real rude. But they had a Horror Writers Association private area. So then suddenly it's like, oh my God, Rick Hodela is there, and Rick Hodela will answer, So it was like, there's, these authors who I have read will now interact with me. And there was a chat room function. So that's how I really got into it. And then once I got involved with ebooks in the real early stages. So, and that was when everyone hated them. So for a few years, once I started getting published, I was much more in the ebook community than the horror community. And then once I started getting books in, because it was no good to go to a horror convention if you had an ebook at that time, because that's not a real book, you suck. So, because people hated ebooks when they first came out, and then Kindle sort of changed everything. So around 2005, it was like, okay, now I have print books out, I can start going to the horror stuff. And so Shock Lines was how I sort of got back into making those connections. And then I have been part of it. Pretty much 2005 was my re-entry. I went to the World Horror Convention in 2005 and then became a big-time member of the horror community. Not big-time in terms of stature, in terms of active participation.
Yeah.
Horror community after that. So,
Well, so what's next after this? What do you got planned coming up?
Right now, a lot of the stuff is like the top secret. A lot of it's screenplay type stuff, which is infuriating because, I'll go online and see, wow, Jeff hasn't, before Deathless came out, it was like, wow, Jeff's a slacker. He hasn't had a new book since the writing life. Like, yes, but I'm working. I promise you I'm working. I'm just not allowed to say anything about it. And so there's been this thing where secret projects have piled up enough. So I look like I'm just, living a life of leisure, but I'm not. I'm always working. But, next up, in a book that keeps getting sidelined because of the top secret stuff, is a book called Creep Out, which is my entry into the possessed ventriloquist dummy genre. So, that I keep, people, when's Creep Out coming out? Creep Out's coming really soon, and then it never does. So my answer remains very soon, but at some point it will be out. So that's going to be the next novel.
Do you like the new atmosphere of Amazon and the way the publishing world's kind of gone in the last few years?
I love it because that's what let me quit my day job, because I was with Leisure. So I had, mass market paperbacks and, if you went into a Barnes Noble, there I am on the shelf. I'm a real author making no money. I'm, it's like, writing for Leisure, it had the prestige of the horror community, but there was no possibility that I would ever do this full time because the money was so low. And so then once I started self-publishing, it was like, wow, I'm keeping 70% of the royalties. And I realized that, this has a path to quitting my day job. And then by being prolific, I finally did. And so I love it. Amazon's the evil empire. I don't agree with that because Amazon created a, model for authors where, I'm fortunate in that my wife, Lynn Hanson, does my covers at a real strong, high professional level. So I don't have the expenses that come from self-publishing stuff. So I can put out a product that, looks like a major New York published product. And then, I'm very good at self-editing, and then I've got my band of trusty proofreaders. So I'm putting out stuff that, it's not like, that's amateur self-published crap. They hopefully are, the equivalent of big traditional published products. And then that let me quit my day job. So I love it. And of course I started out with ebooks when people hated them. Kindle sort of changed it. Now, people enjoy ebooks, and that's where a lot of my income comes from. So, because what it does is it lets books be available, completely available for as long as you keep them in print or keep them available. So, when I was with Leisure, it was great when the book would first come out. You'd go into any bookstore and like, hey, there are 10 copies of Pressure on the shelf. And then at the end of 6 to 8 weeks, it's like, okay, there are a couple and they're spine out. And then, within 6 months, they weren't really on bookstore shelves anymore. Whereas, my first book, Grave Robbers Wine, No Experience Necessary, came out in 2000, but because I got the rights back, anyone who wants it can get it anytime they want. Every one of except for a couple of the early comedies that I purposely said, I don't want someone reading those and thinking that's my newest book. So my first 2 books I've sort of, withdrawn, but everything else, any book I wrote at any stage of my career, you can go onto Amazon and get like it's a brand new book. So the fact that I have my entire back catalog generating royalties every month keeps me from having to sit at a desk and work with numbers all day. So I love it.
Yeah. So how do you like to interact with your fans? Or do you website, social media? What's your preference?
I have a website. I'm a big fan of Facebook and Twitter, and I'm not one of those authors like I have to be on every platform because that's where I'll find readers. Because I barely have time for Facebook and Twitter, so I try to keep, real close tabs on those. So I'm very active on Facebook, very active on Twitter, but I'm not on TikTok or a lot of the other ones. And then I do a newsletter every 2 weeks, which has all my latest news. Every issue of it has a brand new flash fiction story. So it's not, if you subscribe to my newsletter, which the link is on my website, you're not just getting me saying, hey, buy my book, buy my book, buy my book. It's like, hey, here's a brand new free story each issue. So really the newsletter, social media, and then I keep my website updated, but I don't update the blog as much as I should because I tend to focus more on the newsletter and social media.
What's the website?
Website is www.jeffstrand.com.
Okay, we'll have that up on our website as well, so people can find you and hopefully interact with you.
Excellent.
Anyone you want to work with before it's too late?
I'm not actually a great collaborator. I have collaborated. I'm proud of, Han Forster I did with Jim Moore, which is, people love that book. If you like monsters, there are people like, I read that book every year. That is a great book. I did Dracula's, which is also an insane monster extravaganza, but I tend to be kind of power hungry. It's like, I don't like to lose battles, and you have to say, okay, I'm going to let my co-author win this particular dispute. So, there are authors who I really, really like and admire. I love Robert McCammon. I love David Wong. I love Joe Lanza. I don't know that I necessarily aspire to collaborate with Robert McCammon. I just want to read Robert McCammon books. As much as I love Dave Barry, I would collaborate with Dave Barry just because then I would have the, ego boost of, I collaborate with Dave Barry, and now I get to cash in on all of his sales instead of my level of sales. But I don't know that I would bring anything to a Dave Barry collaboration. So it kind of, the authors I admire I would rather just read their books. I don't necessarily aspire to collaborate with anybody.
I'm wondering, horror was like really big, huge in the 80s and 90s before there was a genre implosion. With modern horror today, do you think we're in a resurgence? Do you think horror is making a huge comeback?
Yeah, it seems to be. There's obviously because of self-publishing and because of the distribution now, small press can, have worldwide distribution fairly easily, which is significantly different from the way it was in the 80s and 90s, where small press was a really, really niche market and it was all mass markets. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of good stuff out there. People want to read it. So horror movies are doing incredibly well. Horror TV shows doing incredibly well. And I think it is also transferring to horror fiction. And a lot of the major publishers are trying to get back into it. So yeah, it is. I don't know that it will ever hit the, I would guess that the 80s are gone. The time when you could walk into your grocery store, not just have a horror section, but as you're at the checkout counter, like, hey, here's an impulse purchase. Buy this book with a hologram skull on the cover. Those days are gone, but I think that the publishers see, there is a market and the readers want that. So, yeah, I think a lot of the major publishers are bringing horror lines back, and it is a thriving market.
So how's COVID been for you? Does it affect your writing as well, or do you sort of, I guess it doesn't, you just sort of do it as a job? Yeah,
it doesn't affect my writing because when it first started happening, you're like, oh, how do you work COVID into your books? It's like, you don't, because you don't know where it's going to be. If I write a book, I don't want it in a year to be weird. Unless it's real specifically, if a book is set in March 2020, you have to address it. But if I'm just writing a book set in quote unquote the present, I'm not going to, work because we don't know where it's going to end up. As far as my day-to-day life, it certainly screwed up my social life. I used to get out of the house a lot more. My horror author Brian Kirk, before I moved to Chattanooga, was a neighbor. And so we would have our standing, get together for lunch, and those got canceled for about a year and a half. And a lot of it is, okay, yes, I spend most of my life at home, huddled behind a computer, but at least I get to go out and be social. I get to go to the world. I get to go to the StokerCon and Scares That Care and NeCon and KillerCon, and then those, for the most part, got wiped out. So I'm hoping that 2022 will bring them back, because 2020, everything was canceled. 2021, we at least got Scares That Care in a masked version. And I'm hoping that 2022 will finally start to get to go back to those. But yeah, the whole social aspect of getting to hang out with other horror authors where you come back recharged, ready to go, that COVID definitely took that away. I've been fortunate I haven't caught it because we're pretty deep quarantining. So, but although now we can do that, it's like, well, I also opened my door once and caught it, but
well, yeah. Well, those masking events, you could always, it's a good cover up when you're out there killing people, right? So
yeah. So, it was actually weird because I had been depositing all my checks through just my phone. So I switched to a new bank in Chattanooga. So this was the first time I had to go into a bank since COVID started. Like, this is weird walking to a bank with a mask. This feels very, very wrong. It feels like security should just immediately swoop in and take me away.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how big the mask is and if you're carrying a weapon, I guess.
No, it's a regular blue mask, but still, it's like covering 3/4 of my face feels strange going into a bank.
You have to get used to it, I know.
Yep.
Strange. Well, it's been a great conversation, and we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Now, the book that must be bought, it's called Deathless. Don't miss this book. And our guest is the author, Jeff Strand. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Tired of wasting time trying to decide what to watch on your streaming service? Go to our website and look for the Martino movie reviews.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end! I'll see you.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.